All right, I want you to imagine something for a second. You're 20,000 feet up, floating above the desert. You're just 17 minutes away from safety. You're at your station, plotting the course home, and then you hear it and feel it. It's not an explosion, not like you'd expect. It's a swoosh, a huge jolt, and then this deep whoomp. You look back, and you see the impossible. You see daylight, bright, blinding daylight, where the rest of your airplane is supposed to be.
Now that's not a line from some Hollywood movie. That is the actual, first-hand account of Lieutenant Harry C. Newsell. He was the navigator on a B-17 bomber, called the All-American. He had just looked out through the nose of the plane and watched, just completely stunned, as huge chunks of a German fighter plane tumbled past his window. It wasn't shot down in some fiery explosion, it had physically collided with them. And yet, somehow, impossibly, they were still flying.
And that right there is the real heart of this story. This isn't just about what happened on that day. It's about the how, a how that seems to defy the very laws of physics. How does a 65,000-pound machine, a massive bomber, stay in the air when its own tail is actively trying to rip itself away? And how does a crew of young men deal with a problem that no training manual, no instructor could ever prepare them for? Well, let's dive in and find out.
So let's go back. The date is February 1st, 1943. The mission for the All-American and its bomber group was to hit the port facilities at Tunis. This was a supercritical supply hub for the Axis forces in North Africa. And the bomb run? It was a success. They got direct hits, saw secondary explosions on the ground, mission accomplished. But it was on the turn for home that the enemy fighters showed up.
A German fighter, a Bf 109 flown by a seasoned ace, came screaming in at them. But the All-American's top turret gunner, a guy named Technical Sergeant Joe James, was just a little bit faster. He fired a burst that went straight into the cockpit of the fighter. The German pilot was likely killed instantly, and his 2,000-pound plane was suddenly an unguided missile. It sliced right into the All-American's fuselage just behind the waist gunners, carving this massive, horrifying gash through the plane before it just disintegrated. And the sound, just as Lieutenant Newsell described it, was that unforgettable swoosh and a bang.
But here's the thing. The story of how they survived, it really didn't begin at that moment of impact. No, it began long before that. It started with a very unique combination of the men on board and the machine they were flying, both of them forged for a moment exactly like this, even though they never could have known it.
In the pilot's seat, you had First Lieutenant Kendrick Sonny Bragg. He was only 25, but he had this quiet confidence of someone who already knew what it was like to win against impossible odds. See, back home, he was the halfback for Duke University's legendary 1938 Iron Dukes. That was a football team that was undefeated and unscored upon the entire regular season. That mindset, that absolute stubborn refusal to accept defeat, it was about to be tested, not on a football field, but in the cockpit of a dying airplane.
And then you have the plane itself, the B-17 Flying Fortress. Its serial number was 4124406. You know, its very name was a promise. Flying Fortress. The engineers back at Boeing had built this thing specifically with combat damage in mind. It had redundant systems, backup controls, and a kind of structural integrity that was about to be pushed way beyond what anyone thought was possible. This wasn't just any plane. It was a machine built on one single philosophy: survival.
So for the crew of the All-American, the next 90 minutes must have felt like an absolute eternity. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, steady, unbelievably calm.
Pilot to crew. Check in. Everybody okay?
And miraculously, no one was seriously hurt. But then he called for the tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Sam Saralis, and all he got back was silence.
The damage, it was just catastrophic. The left horizontal stabilizer, which is a critical piece you need to control the plane's pitch, completely gone, just sheared off. The fuselage was filleted open like a sardine can, and the entire tail section, with poor Sam Saralis trapped inside, was hanging on by nothing more than a few inches of twisted metal. It was swaying back and forth, independent of the rest of the plane, moving several feet out of alignment with every gust of wind. One of the crewmen later described it perfectly. He said it was like a kite on a string in a hurricane.
90 minutes, just think about that. An hour and a half of flying an aircraft that by all rights should have already broken apart and fallen out of the sky. Every little pocket of turbulence, every gentle turn, threatened to be the final straw that would tear the tail completely off. Bragg and his co-pilot, Godfrey Engel, they had to fly by pure instinct now. They were using the engines, applying more power to one side than the other, using these tiny, gentle inputs on the controls, just wrestling this 30-ton crippled beast all the way home.
And while this is all going on, back in that swaying tail section, Sam Cyrillus makes a choice. He starts this harrowing 30-foot crawl through the mangled, flexing, groaning fuselage. And when he finally makes it back to the main cabin, you know what the first thing he does is? He hands the jacket to one of the waist gunners. It belonged to the pilot. And he says, make sure the skipper gets this back. He might need it when we land. I mean, in the face of almost certain death, his biggest concern was a borrowed jacket and making sure his pilot was comfortable. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of crew this was.
So how? How did they stay in the air? The answer isn't some single, simple miracle. It's actually a combination of engineering genius, incredible pilot skill, and just raw human grit. And it all starts with the design of the plane itself. The secret weapon of the B-17 was something called semi-monocoque construction. Now, older planes, they basically relied on an internal skeleton, kind of like our bodies. But the B-17, its strength was distributed across its entire aluminum skin, which was reinforced by all these frames and stringers. The best way to think about it is, it's less like a skeleton with skin over it, and more like an eggshell. This design created incredible structural redundancy. It meant that when the main structures failed, other secondary or even tertiary structures could pick up the load. The B-17 was literally designed to have huge pieces blown off of it and keep on flying.
The survival of the All-American, well, it had this immediate and profound impact on both sides. For the Allied crews, it became this morale-boosting legend. The story spread like wildfire. If that plane could make it back home, then any plane could. But for the German Luftwaffe, it was a source of just shock and utter frustration. One of their top aces, a guy named Adolf Galland, he later wrote about how demoralizing it was to just pour cannon shells into these flying fortresses only to watch them limp back home. This one single incident helped force them to completely rethink their tactics, leading them to develop heavier cannons and even rockets just to try and deal with the unbelievable toughness of the B-17. So, as we start to pull all these pieces together, it becomes really clear that it wasn't just the plane's design. It was this perfect storm of factors, and every single one was absolutely essential. I mean it. If you take away any single one of these factors, this story has a very, very different ending.
So what are the ingredients for this miracle? Okay, first, that redundant engineering we just talked about. Second, Kendrick Bragg's unbelievable skill, flying not by the book, but purely by the feel of a plane that was on the very edge of falling apart. Third, that unshakable teamwork, from the gunner who took out the fighter in the first place, to Sam Cyrillus' insane crawl, to the other bombers in the formation who actually flew alongside them to form a protective shield. And fourth, you have to look at the bigger picture. The industrial might of a nation that could produce thousands of these incredibly tough aircraft, built by people on the home front who knew that their work was the difference between a crew coming home or not.
After 90 agonizing minutes, Bragg brought the All-American in for a landing. He had to come in fast, with no flaps, and the plane skidded down the runway in a shower of sparks. But they were home. All 10 men walked away without a single scratch. And here's the final, just unbelievable detail. After everything had settled down, a few of the ground crew, curious, climbed onto the wreckage to get a better look. Their combined weight, maybe 500 pounds, was the final straw. With a groan of tortured metal, the entire tail section, the very same section that had flown for an hour and a half through the sky, it just collapsed right there on the runway.
You see, the All-American didn't survive because of some last-minute miracle. It survived because of strengths that were deliberately built into it long before the crisis ever hit. A resilient design, a determined pilot, a unified crew. And that really forces us to ask a bigger question, doesn't it? What are the hidden strengths that we are building into our own systems today, into our communities, and even into ourselves? What are the resilient designs that will allow us, when that completely unexpected crisis hits, to also find a way to fly home?